On behalf of General Myatt and the Marines Memorial Association, I'd like to welcome everybody to the special event. Tonight, there's a gentleman by the name of Brigadier Rod Macdonald who's going to talk to us. I met Brigadier Macdonald during Fleet Week, actually. He was the moderator on a panel that we were having at a senior leaders seminar, a panel on the international refugee crisis. And I want to say that was the first time that I'd started working with him, met him through that program, and he's a fabulous speaker. It's nice to welcome Brigadier Rod Macdonald back to the club, this time to talk about his own combat experiences in a campaign that is highly relevant to the Marine Corps today. He began his career in the British Armed Forces at 16 years of age, and he hasn't aged a bit. After officer training at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst, he served for a further 25 years as a Royal Engineer officer in Armored Parachute and Commando forces with 3 Commando Brigade Royal Marines. He led British forces in active service in Northern Ireland in multiple tours throughout the 1970s and led 59 independent Commando Squadron Royal Engineers in combat in 1982 in the Falkland Wars, where he was mentioned in dispatches, and is the first Allied member of the Marines Memorial Club. And so please join me in welcoming Brigadier Macdonald.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be back here in the Marine Memorial Club. General Myatt, it's an honor to be able to talk to all of you and many friends in the audience, which I greatly appreciate. Before I start, I'd like to answer one question I'm constantly asked, and that is, why are British and Commonwealth officers called brigadiers and not brigadier generals? In 1921, the British Treasury was dismayed by the large number of relatively young brigadier generals promoted during World War I, when Britain had its biggest army ever. General officers could not be appointed temporarily, and when retired, they were entitled to half pay and expenses rather than a less costly pension. As a result, the British Army abolished the rank of Brigadier General and ceased to use the brigade as a tactical formation. The subsequent unitary division proved unwieldy, and brigades were reinstated in 1928, commanded now by a brigadier, redesignated as a field officer rank, eligible for a pension rather than the largesse offered to general officers on retirement. In short, the rank of brigadier replaced brigadier generals to save money. There was no change to the work of the role. In fact, the responsibility of brigadiers increased over the previous brigadier general's role. So now you know. So if the US wants to save a bit of money, just get rid of brigadier generals and replace them with brigadiers. Now the Falkland Islands campaign. And during this presentation, I'm going to be referring to maps, and I'll point out a number of locations for you that I'd like you to try and remember as I move forward. And I promise I won't give you more than 3 or 4 to remember on any one slide. First of all, you should understand this was not a war, technically, because war was never declared. But at first, let's give you some background perspective with a few statistics which we've already seen published, but it's worth going through them again. This is the longest amphibious operation, 8,000 miles in history, the largest air-sea battle since World War II. Over 1,000 died, 2,000 wounded, 23 ships either lost or damaged, 91 aircraft, 23 helicopters, all destroyed in a matter of weeks. The Argentine junta, which had murdered around 30,000 of its own people, fell, and the Falkland Islands, by the way, there are around 400 of them, remain British. Now I'm going to point out on some slides some important locations. These are the Falkland Islands here. So around 400 islands stretching over a period of 1,000 miles. The ones that you want to focus on are these here, closest to Argentina. There's 2 islands there. One's called East Falkland, and the other one, surprisingly enough, is called West Falkland. So that's point 1 to remember. Point 2 is South Georgia here. Right, the next point to remember, and there's really only three because I'm assuming you know where the United Kingdom is, and that's Ascension Island here, in the equatorial area of the South Atlantic. So in outline, it's 4,000 miles from here to here, roughly, and another 4,000 miles down to here. Let me take you back 35 years ago to 1982 in order to set the social and political context. The British people then, like now, were going through a crisis of identity and tough economic times. Difficult decisions were being made, not least about defense. These are the leaders of the two countries at the time. So you've got Margaret Thatcher, who you all know, and then you've got, this is Leopoldo Galtieri. He was sort of head of the junta. And then here's number two, was Admiral Anya here. He was head of the Argentine Navy and had a sort of political and military history. And then here we have Secretary of State for Defense, my dear friend, John Nott. John Nott, the Secretary of State for Defense, had decided to get rid of our most flexible of forces, the amphibious fleet, the Royal Marines, and Parachute Regiment, in favor of nuclear missile submarines. Nott just did not believe in anything other than the Central Front and deterrence. And he didn't understand maritime strategy. In fact, in November 1981, Julian Thompson, my brigade commander, and myself showed him around HMS Fearless, our LPD landing platform dock, which is about exactly half the size of the USS San Diego that was here for Fleet Week. At one stage, Nott turned round to Julian Thompson and said, "I didn't know we had ships like this in the Royal Navy." The Navy had struggled for years against cuts to their budget, so much so that many of their ships lacked defensive measures against air and missile attack simply due to lack of cash. You know, they had a choice. They either had one or two ships which were properly gunned, or they had a number of ships without the right weapons. They opted for having more ships because they worked on the principle that if more money came available, they could always put more weapon systems on them. Our Invincible class carriers, that's this little puppy here, they were not carriers of the fleet sort that you're used to. They were actually called through-deck cruisers because fleet carriers were banned, and so the Navy came up with a cunning plan to create through-deck cruisers rather than aircraft carriers, and this was the result. There was no love lost at all between John Nott and the Royal Navy and the Royal Marines. He had made the decision to withdraw the British Antarctic survey ship HMS Endurance, that you can see on the slide, from the South Atlantic in the 1981 Defense Review. This was the only naval vessel in the region of the Falkland Islands, and Royal Naval officers considered this sent a signal to the Argentine that Britain was unwilling and soon would be unable to defend the territories and subjects of the Falklands. A strategic political and intelligence failure was brewing at every level in government and in the intelligence community. Argentine military planning for the invasion of the Malvinas, as they call the islands, started in December 1981. In February 1982, Argentine Marines were training for the invasion in Patagonia, and on March the 9th, the Argentine junta received the first draft of the invasion plan. On March the 19th, 1982, so-called scrap workers raised the Argentine flag on South Georgia, and you all know where that is now. This was the first time that the dormice in the British Embassy in Buenos Aires awoke from their torpor and realized that something was going on. Now I'm going to use Alice in Wonderland as a metaphor throughout this presentation. And the first part of Alice in Wonderland you're going to be introduced to now is the dormouse. All right? Now you know the dormouse from the Mad Hatter's Tea Party in Alice in Wonderland. That's the little mouse that falls asleep in his tea. A dormouse is a real animal that lives in the United Kingdom and is deeply loved. It's a very small mouse and very furry. It's got a furry tail. And it sleeps for 6 months of the year. And for the remaining 6 months, 3 months, it's in a state of torpor, where it's sort of in a semi-sleep. These are the perfect requirements for people in intelligence roles. On March the 27th, 2 Royal Fleet auxiliary ships and fleet tankers, Apple Leaf and replenishment ship Fort Austin, were given orders to head to the South Atlantic. Now, one of the other things that's going to come out in this presentation is logistics, actually supplying ships at sea and a fleet at sea, and then supplying troops on the land over this distance. In order to sustain a fleet, you have to have the ability for that fleet to refuel. You have to have the ability for that fleet to be replenished. And so these ships are some of the most important ships in the Navy. On March the 28th, the Argentine invasion force sailed from Argentina, and on March the 29th, Prime Minister Thatcher openly deployed nuclear submarines south as a show of force in an attempt to halt the invasion. On March the 31st, Thatcher authorized planning for deployment of forces, and on April the 2nd, Argentine Marines landed and captured Stanley on East Falkland and then South Georgia. The domestically unpopular Argentine military junta had succeeded in its aim. The Argentine population was thrilled. For the British nation, after many years of perceived humiliation and decline, this was the last straw. The public rallied behind Thatcher's call to launch a task force. Ships were rapidly taken up from trade. Here's the cruise ship Canberra, the first of 54 ships taken up from trade. They were called stuffed ships. They were converted with helicopter platforms and loaded with stores within days. Many of these stores were never seen again. This was the ship on which I returned after the conflict. In a matter of days, thanks to outstanding work from civilian workforce, some of whom were still working on the ships as they sailed, converting them to be able to refuel at sea and accommodate many hundreds of troops. It was an extraordinary achievement just to get these ships to sail within 72 hours. Now I think it's time to talk about the Commando Brigade Royal Marines. This Commando Brigade consists of 3 Royal Marine Commandos. These are essentially infantry battalions, but they're called commandos by the Royal Marines. They have a Commando Artillery Regiment in support, and they're staffed by Artillery Army Commandos, who have all gone through the same training as the Royal Marines. They have a Brigade Air Squadron with their own helicopters, a Brigade Signal Squadron for communication. The Naval Air Squadron here is Royal Navy, those are the support helicopters. The SBS, which is like your SEALs, except they don't write as many books. And an assault raiding squadron, and my squadron here, which is the Commando Squadron Royal Engineers. This unit is quite unique. This is a Commando Logistics Regiment. This does not exist in the US Marine Corps. And this was the most important and essential part of the entire brigade. It was an integrated logistics support regiment designed to support the brigade. The brigade was further reinforced by 2 Para Battalion and the 3rd Parachute Battalion from 5 Brigade. On the 2nd of April, 1982, I was commanding the engineer squadron you see here. Much of my squadron was still returning from Arctic training in Norway when I was called to brigade headquarters at 3 in the morning on April the 2nd to meet my commander, Brigadier Julian Thompson, who commanded the brigade. All the officers in the Commando Brigade were commando trained, all wore the same green beret and knew each other well, and most importantly, they trusted each other. The Commando Brigade was mountain and Arctic warfare trained, spending 3 months each year in the winter living out and training in northern Norway. And yes, that is me 35 years ago with my commando sappers behind me on skis. I was also part of Julian Thompson's recce group and planning group. It was my job, as well as commanding 5-9 Squadron, to be part of the very small team that would write and then implement the plan to recover the Falkland Islands. So here's the first lesson for commanders. When an emergency really occurs, as distinct from an exercise, you do not have time to do anyone else's job but your own. I had to rely entirely on my subordinates to carry out their responsibility to bring the squadron to readiness and embark within 72 hours without supervision. As a NATO force assigned to defend northern Norway, the entire Commando Brigade was permanently on 72 hours notice to move. My squadron was split between 5 different ships and my engineer logistics between even more. My headquarters was co-located with 3 Commando Brigade on HMS Fearless, which you can see here. And on April the 6th, which is when we joined the ship, we immediately sat down on the floor of Julian Thompson's cabin on HMS Fearless to work out what we were going to do. We had received no orders at all other than to deploy. Our task was daunting. We were about to embark on the longest amphibious operation in military history, with a ragtag of amphibious force that was unlikely to achieve air superiority. As US Marines know, the history of amphibious operations is a bloody one, and omens indicated that tradition would now continue. Even then, and I was 34 years of age at the time, what we were about to do was clear to me. If we fought, whether we won or we lost, one national government or another was going to fall. There were a lot of people who believed that we weren't going to fight. The general feeling was that if we deployed and just went into a poised position, which US Marines understand, then politicians would have time to sort this out. Both Julian Thompson and myself completely disagreed with that analysis. If you look at the personality of Galtieri, who has staked the entire future of his junta and government on retaining the Falklands, and then you look at the personality of Margaret Thatcher, who has staked the entire future and credibility of her government on getting them back, there really wasn't any room at all for compromise. We were faced with an enemy force that was around 10,000 strong and plenty of time to prepare defensive positions. The strength of our reinforced brigade with 2 parachute battalions was 5,000. We would also be outgunned. For example, they had 155mm guns, we had 105. And we were going to lack air superiority despite what we were being told. Even reaching the islands without being blown out of the water by the Argentine Air Force and Navy was a question. I'll just run through the people in this little group here. This is a guy called Ewan Sotheby Taylor, and I'll be talking about him very shortly. Extremely important member of the team from a naval perspective. This is a guy called Viv Rowe, he was head of intelligence. This is Jerry Wells Cole, he was the senior logistics officer. The late John Chester here, he was chief of staff, and Julian Thompson. Initially, our intelligence information was limited to what we had seen on the BBC and what our intelligence section could grab from the Plymouth Library, James Fighting Ships of the World, Military Balance, and donated slides, photos and assumptions based on Argentina's close ties with the US military. Luckily, we had a Royal Marine officer on board HMS Fearless, Ewan Sotheby Taylor, who you've now seen, who spent a year on the islands and as an ocean sailor had mapped and taken sounds of every cove. His information was invaluable in deciding where we should land. The Falkland Islands is a brutally cold, windy and snowy place, and we were heading into an Antarctic winter war, a similar type of environment to winter in northern Norway, where we were trained and ready to fight. We decided that the capital Stanley was the vital ground. West Falkland, East Falkland. And this is where we chose to land, here, San Carlos. If we took Stanley, the rest of the Argentine position would collapse. We didn't have the firepower or capability to carry out an assault on Stanley, but if we could get ashore in a lightly defended location, perhaps we could leverage our ability to fight in really cold climates in an Antarctic winter and fight our way through the mountains to Stanley. This whole area is mountainous through here, and that's where we were going to go. Our thoughts were, the colder and more inhospitable the environment, the better it would be. Our small carriers would need to stay far to the east, outside of the range of the Argentine jets with Exocet missiles. If we were going to gain air superiority, we were going to have to build a Harrier strip and refueling location ashore to give our Sea Harriers more time over the islands. By April the 10th, en route to the South Atlantic, we had a plan. And this was the plan. It was to come in here, seize this area, use our ships as our mobile logistics support, and then fight our way through the mountains here to Stanley. Because we had so few troops compared with the number of Argentine troops, we didn't want any troops diverted away from our force to go and take land which was not in any way essential to winning the operation. And what I mean by that is, before we even arrived here, they took some troops away from us to go and retake South Georgia, which politically probably looked good, but did absolutely nothing to really achieve the aim of taking Stanley, which was the vital ground. In fact, the entire concept of vital ground was unknown to the Navy. Before we could put this into action, we had to restow all our ships, because logistics had just been, and stores had just been loaded on ships as they arrived without any plan. Once we had a plan, we could then restow the ships ready for an assault landing. We also had to gain approval for our plan. This was all going to take place on Ascension Island, almost exactly halfway to the Falkland Islands. Ascension Island is a small volcanic island in the equatorial waters of the South Atlantic. It's governed as a British overseas territory. It has a US presence called Cabled Wireless, and Pan Am ran the airfield, which is here called Wide Awake. The reality was it was an Anglo-American signals intelligence facility, along with the BBC World Service Relay Station and European Space Agency rocket tracking station. It's not the place a cruise ship would be allowed to land. The US residents could not have been more helpful. The Pan Am manager responsible for running Wide Awake Airfield said to Brigadier Julian Thompson, "My president says you can have anything you want." He meant the president of Pan Am, not the president of the US, but it was obvious that direction was coming from higher up, indeed from the very top, and was not restricted to what Wide Awake could provide. The assistance from the US included AIM-9L Sidewinders, diverted with support from Israel, and they were diverted across to us, setting up a stream of fuel tankers to keep the fuel tanks and Royal Engineer-built fuel systems at Ascension topped up throughout, valuable intelligence, and much else. Even the Vulcan refueling probes, Vulcans were the swept-wing bombers the British were using to bomb Stanley. Vulcan refueling probes were removed from a United States Air Force museum. I think this is where I started to fall in love with the US. I was already developing strong feelings towards the Harrier aircraft, which is almost small enough for you to give it a good hug. And I was already in love with my ship, HMS Fearless. But little known to us, we were about to unfall unwittingly down an Alice in Wonderland rabbit hole. The rabbit hole starts with a chain of command above the amphibious task group with 3 Commando Brigade. Now, the amphibious task group are these 2 groups here. So Commander Clapp commands the amphibious task group, and when the landing force, this is very familiar to the US Marines here, when the landing force is on board ship, they come under command of the amphibious task group commander. When the landing force goes ashore, there's this very important period when you chop command and command reverts to the land force commander. So we were all here on HMS Fearless. These characters here, they didn't deploy till later, till virtually the war was over, and we'll talk about them later. But all of the naval ships, other than the amphibious task force, particularly the carriers, were under command of Admiral Woodward. And he was Commander Naval Battle Group South Atlantic. And he kind of understandably felt that he was in charge of the whole thing. But the reality was that everyone reported to Admiral Fieldhouse here, who was based in Northwood in the UK. He flew out to Ascension to meet us. We were due to meet up on HMS Hermes, which was Woodward's flagship, to hammer out what plan we were going to employ. For me, April the 17th, which I refer to as the Mad Hatter's Tea Party, was the most stressful day of the campaign. I've emailed my old commander, Julian Thompson, about this recently, and he confirms he felt the same. Between Fieldhouse, Woodward, and their staff, there was little to no knowledge of the most difficult of war-fighting pastimes, which is amphibious operations. Every headquarters was presenting their own plans, some bordering on delusional, not least around requiring me to build an airfield for F-4 Phantom II jet interceptor fighter bombers on West Falkland, even closer to Argentina. As well as not understanding the huge size, scale, and time of building an airfield for fast jets, there was no understanding of vital ground. The battle is about Stanley, nothing else. Or amphibious and battlefield logistics, which limited how long we could fight. The naive assumption on the part of some that we would have air superiority was frankly breathtaking. All this did little to help the lack of understanding and trust between the landing force carrier group and the headquarters in Northwood in the UK. After a prolonged, intense, and very direct engagement between parties, Julian Thompson, with me in close support, managed to prevail. Our plan was approved. We had already started to put it into action with a logistic restow between ships, and now it was official. Anyone who thought there was going to be a diplomatic solution and we were not going to fight had to rethink when on May the 2nd, the cruiser General Belgrano was sunk by the Royal Navy's hunter-killer nuclear submarine, HMS Conqueror. 2 days later, our HMS Sheffield, the Type 42 guided missile destroyer, was hit by one of two AIM-39 Exocet missiles fired from two Argentine Super Intard aircraft. When she sank, HMS Sheffield became the first Royal Naval ship lost in action since the end of World War II. She would not be the last. The slower logistics ships had sailed before, but on May the 8th, we sailed south on HMS Fearless into South Atlantic gales and rough seas. The performance of the Royal Navy at sea was extraordinary, well up to the traditions of their service, and this is resupplying in heavy seas. This photo is of a helicopter on the stern of an LSL, landing ship logistic, and gives you an idea of the size of the sea. There were times I would climb out on the side of HMS Fearless and watch the amphibious task force plowing through the South Atlantic seas. Sleek destroyers diving almost entirely under the wave. Orange-painted cross-channel steamers battling through the storms. I thought, only the British would either be so audacious or crazy to do this. We felt extremely vulnerable to Argentine naval fleet, surface and air attack, not least when Russian Bear Tu-95s flew low and slow over our fleet. The reality was that the Russians didn't pass any information on to the Argentine, but you can imagine how we felt when they were doing that. It was probably a good thing. We knew nothing about the fiasco unfolding on May the 17th in Chile and Argentina with operations Mikado and Plum Duff, when the SAS tried and failed to take out the AIM-39 Exocet missiles and aircrafts in Argentina. It was a gloomy, wet, foggy night when the landing force slipped into San Carlos water and launched the first full amphibious landing operation against an enemy-occupied coast since Korea. It was daybreak on the 21st of May when the war really started. Demonstrating their audacious capability, which we knew we had to counteract, wave after wave of Argentine aircraft swooped in to attack the ships in San Carlos water and Falkland Sound, as well as the landing force. No Western military force has experienced being under continual air attack since the beginning of World War II. This famous picture is of HMS Antelope, a Plymouth-based Type 42 destroyer that accompanied us all the way down from Plymouth. It blew up at night, only 100 meters from our brigade headquarters. I didn't know it at the time, but two Royal Engineer bomb disposal engineers attached to my squadron were trying to defuse the bomb when it went off. During those next 5 days, in the Battle of San Carlos Water, 4 ships were sunk, 7 damaged from airstrikes, and 1 Exocet missile attack. 57 men were killed and 72 wounded, and more importantly than all of that, much needed supplies were now under the sea. It was hazardous to be in the open on the shore during the attacks. The Argentine jets were flying so low that the fall of shot from our own ships firing at aircraft was landing among the troops surrounding San Carlos Bay. I remember one day waiting for my helicopter sitting on the shore as the Argentine jets flew into the bay, attacking the ships and our own units, when the ground around me became a mass of falling shot from our own side. One went through my pack, which was sitting beside me, and embedded itself in a spare pair of socks. Our ships were taking such a pounding that the Navy ordered many of them to sail, with most of our logistics still on board. On May the 24th, I landed on my logistics ship, Sir Lancelot. All the landing ship logistics were named after the Knights of the Round Table, to see my recce troop and floating echelon. The helicopter flew fast and low to avoid Argentine jets. I quickly jumped out onto the back deck, and the helicopter rapidly flew away. I was surprised to see that there was no one there to greet me. I walked to the bridge, and there was a telephone hanging, swinging with the roll of the ship. It was like being on the Mary Celeste. I then realized the ship had been evacuated. I looked over the starboard side and saw there was a large hole in the side of the ship. I was on board the ship without any form of communications, with a huge unexploded bomb, with no one else on board, and it took the hour seemed to last a very long time before my helicopter came back to pick me up. The pilot, Peter Cameron, who was also the helicopter squadron commander and a good friend, could hardly take off, he was laughing so much. The blackest day for us in combat was May the 25th, when an Exocet missile sank the Atlantic conveyor. The missile was intended for one of the carriers. The ship went down with most of our support helicopters and most of the engineer stores intended for the airfield, but we built one anyway. We were under pressure from our joint force headquarters in Northwood near London to get moving. We did not understand, because it was not explained to us, the political pressure on them from activities in the UN. We, on the other hand, felt Northwood did not appreciate the situation we were in with the loss of our heavy lift helicopters and logistics ships sailing away in the daylight. I'm sure they didn't realize there are absolutely no roads in the Falkland Islands. There are now, by the way, but there weren't then. And we had left nearly all of our wheeled vehicles behind, which made helicopters even more critical. It was taking a great deal of time moving the stores ashore from our logistics ships at night. We had very limited communications. We could only communicate with the headquarters from a ship. On the other hand, the Special Air Service, who were kind of running their own operations out of control from us, had their own satellite communications where they could communicate directly back to the UK. This was used to back channel us to the highest levels and stirred up a lot of trouble. We felt we were fighting on multiple fronts, not just against the Argentine, but also the Royal Navy, who controlled our logistics and naval helicopters, the SAS, and the headquarters in Northwood. Encouraged by the SAS, Northwood ordered us to attack Goose Green down here, and this delayed our plan to attack over the mountains to Stanley. Colonel H. Jones, the CO of the 2nd Parachute Battalion, who were dug in around this area and closest to Goose Green, was very keen to attack this location. And on May the 28th, we let him go. He was killed in the first part of the attack, which had ground to a halt. His outstanding second-in-command, Chris Keeble, took over. He called in Harrier support, which combined with naval gunfire and the fighting spirit of the Paras, won the day. We captured 1,200 prisoners, including 2 senior officers. I scooped up a bunch of Argentine mines, having learned how to defuse them, and took them back to my other commando and parachute engineers so they could learn how to clear them before the next phase of the attacks over the mountains. Our hospital and logistic base at Ajax Bay was hit in an air attack. Surgeon Commander Rick Jolly, and by the way, this was the hospital here, and there was an unexploded bomb right in the roof, right above the operating theatre. Surgeon Commander Rick Jolly continued operating, not losing a single British or Argentine casualty. He was the only man to be decorated by both sides in the conflict. The commanders and paras pushed on into the mountains. Without helicopters, we'd have to walk all the way across the rock runs and peat bogs. The distance was 75 miles. The conditions were just as bad as we hoped or feared when we wrote the plan. 4-2 Commando on Mount Kent, which I'll point out in the future, with 2 troops from 5-9 Squadron suffered over 100 cold weather injuries. If we were suffering, it had to be worse for the Argentine. This is the brigade headquarters in the snow. By June the 2nd, we had completed the Harrier and helicopter forward operating base with repair panels we brought to repair the airfield at Stanley, along with an emergency fuel handling installation, pumping AVCAT from oilers via huge moored floating rubber Dracones via moored pump rafts to the shore. We were delivering over 40,000 gallons of AVCAT each day, with 2 GR3 and 2 Sea Harriers ashore at first light, giving the Harriers more time to react and more time in combat air patrol over the island. This turned around the air situation and effectively meant we were going to win the war. It was also the same day that the 2nd Brigade, 5 Brigade, arrived without any logistic support of their own, putting a further strain on the hard-pressed Commando Logistic Regiment and further delaying our advance on the Argentine mountain stronghold. So this is basically the logistic plan. So here we are in San Carlos. Our idea was to sail our logistic ships, which we did, down here into Teal Inlet. If you remember, I was talking about Mount Kent. Mount Kent's here. And that picture you saw of those soldiers in the mountains, sort of smiling but looking slightly grimy, that was taken on Mount Kent. And that overlooks Bluff Cove here. So the plan was we walked all this way up into the mountains, and then we were going to fight through these final range of mountains here into Stanley. 5 Brigade were keen to take back the 2nd Parachute Battalion under command, and they were, of course, stuck down here at Goose Green. So once they took them back in command, they telephoned Fitzroy, the Fitzroy settlement, and talked to the people there and found that there were no Argentines there. So they flew 2 para in by helicopter into here. Meanwhile, the Royal Marines sitting up here didn't realize that these are British troops, thought they were Argentine troops, and demanded a fire mission down on what was in fact our own troops. Luckily, we had a really sensible artillery commander sitting back in brigade headquarters, which was by this time located here, and he just didn't believe it. And he said, I want you to check with 5 Brigade to see what they're doing. And of course, as soon as we checked with 5 Brigade, we realized they're our own troops. So, that's a really good example of requiring commanders to be a bit thoughtful rather than gung-ho. 5 Brigade then decided that what they were going to do, because they got no experience of being under air attack, that they would sail a couple of LSLs right the way around here into here, which was completely overlooked by Argentines here. This was a disaster. It was a costly mistake, and I couldn't believe my eyes. I was watching it. I carried an 8mm camera through the entire campaign, as Susan knows here. As luck would have it, I ran out of film as the attack came in. The total film footage that I took during the campaign is available for anyone to watch on YouTube. It's called Commando Engineers in the Falklands War. And the one you want to watch is version 2, but version 1's still okay. The June 8th debacle caused further delays. During this waiting time, commando and parachute engineers cleared the way through the Argentine minefields at night, laying out routes for the Royal Marine Commandos and the parachute infantry. On the night of June 11th and 12th, 3 Commando Brigade launched simultaneous attacks on Mount Harriet, 2 Sisters, and Mount Longdon. So we attacked these 3 mountains in phase 1 of our attack. The second phase was to bring 2 para, who were then back under our command, through Mount Longdon and attack through Wireless Ridge. All attacks took place at night because we were used to operating at night, and the ground was so open it would have been suicidal to move in the daytime. On June the 12th, I was returning from the battle on Mount Longdon to brigade headquarters by helicopter with my QMSI, a guy called Pete Ellis, a warrant officer class 2. We jumped out of the helicopter, which sensibly landed some way away from brigade headquarters, and we were making our way towards brigade headquarters when we saw an Argentine A4 Skyhawk flying fast directly towards us. I'm sure he was targeting the helicopters. He was only a few feet above the ground, and we watched one 250-pound bomb leave each wing and the retard parachutes deploy. The bombs were coming directly for us. We hit the deck, with both of us thinking, well, this is it. The two bombs landed either side of us and exploded. We were buried in mud, rock, and Falklands peat. The next thing I knew was WO2 Ellis shaking me, saying, "Are you all right, sir?" We both were. We brushed ourselves down and continued to our engineer over snow vehicle, a BB-202 that was part of the brigade headquarters. These are really invaluable vehicles. These are the vehicles we used in Norway, and they were perfect out here. So the brigade headquarters consisted of 4 of these, backed up against each other. Okay, so you'd have one engineer vehicle, one operations vehicle, one intelligence vehicle, and one artillery vehicle, and that was the brigade headquarters. Later that day, commando and parachute engineers replaced a collapsed bridge over the Marl River to reopen the supply lines for the final attacks. This was the only surviving Chinook from the Atlantic conveyor. It just happened to be flying at the time the ship was hit. It continued flying throughout the entire campaign without any spares or backup, and is a great credit to Boeing. On the night of June the 13th, 2 Para, now back under 3 Commando Brigade command, launched a coordinated attack on the final positions defending Stanley, Wireless Ridge. This is probably the best attack of the campaign, coordinating artillery, naval gunfire support, and light tanks, CBRT, that you can see on the slide. As a result, our casualties were light. I joined 2 Para, my recce engineer commanders at first light, on June the 14th as we worked our way around the back of Mount Tumbledown, where fighting was still going on. So as we were attacking down Wireless Ridge, 5 Brigade were attacking Mount Tumbledown. But they hadn't taken it by the time we got right through here. By the time we got down to Moody Brook Barracks and were close to Stanley, we noticed that there were white flags flying from the Argentine positions. We pushed on into Stanley, where Julian Thompson met us. This is a rare photograph of Julian Thompson and his recce group in Stanley. You can see Julian, myself behind him, the late Commander Artillery, and in fact this guy here is the journalist Max Hastings. Major General Jeremy Moore, Royal Marines, had taken overall command of the land forces when 5 Brigade arrived. And at the end of the conflict, he negotiated the final surrender, as I was talking to the Argentine chief engineer in the room next door, trying to find out about the mine situation. Here's a picture of commando engineers, they're the ones in the camouflage outfits, with their Argentine engineer counterparts, working together to see how they could recognize and lift the thousands of mines which have been laid. Now that's completely another story as to what happened there. But many of these people are still in contact today. In fact, I have a number of Argentine engineer Facebook friends, believe it or not, who were actually out there. There was still a lot of work to do disarming, feeding, and repatriating 10,000 plus Argentine prisoners, as well as repairing the airfield at Stanley, accommodation facilities, electrical utilities, restoring fresh water, power, as well as unexploded devices. By June the 24th, the first British C-130 landed on the repaired Stanley airfield. The next day, June 25, we embarked on SS Canberra, and by July 11, we were home. The Royal Navy and Merchant Navy had shown extraordinary feats of seamanship in mountainous seas and ability to fight against the Argentine Navy and Air Force. In the ground war, the leadership of Julian Thompson and the toughness of the Royal Marine Commandos and paratroopers won the day. We freed British subjects in the Falkland Islands from an alien occupation. Moreover, we liberated the Argentine population on the mainland from a brutal military dictatorship. However, we don't get much credit from that, from the Argentine. But most of all, We brought pride and a sense of vision and possibility back to our nation. It changed the way the British felt about themselves. From the day I first went to the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, I carried around a quote from Field Marshal Slim in my wallet. I've lost it now, but here's the spirit of that quote. No country can bestow any greater honor on any man or woman than he or she be called to lead their fellow countrymen in battle. I can say with absolute certainty I have been given no greater honor in my long life than that. Thus it was then, and thus it is now. Thank you. I don't know a lot of detail about the stuff ships and how they were converted. I mean, we just saw it being done. But it was a 24-hour operation. All the workers, who were many of them unionized, and you know there were major issues with the trade unions in the UK, they all just worked flat out, 24 hours a day. And then, of course, the naval architects, you know, were called into play to convert these ships into more usable ships for such a venture. For example, even in Ascension Island, you know, I had engineers actually cutting off the sides of container ships so that helicopters could actually, you know, land on them. I mean, with blowtorches. I mean, we had to be a little careful dropping those steel bits over the side because they could have gone down and hold the ship, you know, and then that would have been really embarrassing. So there was work going on all the time to try and convert and improve the ships. One of the things that was new to me, because I spent a lot of time on board ship with the Commando Brigade, and I felt I was, you know, part of the Royal Marine scene. But when you go to war, so much more is stuffed on those ships. I mean, just the gangways, corridors were all filled with boxes of food and stores, so that even just walking down the corridors, you had to sort of bend because it was half full with stores. You know, in the South Atlantic gales, you'd be walking on the boxes, then you'd be walking actually on the side on the side because the ship was moved right over, and then you'd walk back on the boxes and walk on the side. It was quite extraordinary. You know, a cabin which would normally be for, you know, 1 or 2 people had 6 people in it. You know, the ships were all overloaded. But the planning that's required of an amphibious operation, and the U.S. Marine Corps, you know, is well aware of this. But if you have a ship that heavily loaded, and you've got to get people from different parts of the ship, Marines from different parts of the ship with all their equipment, and they can't pass each other in the corridor, you have to plan where each individual person is going to go to get to his, in our case, there were unfortunately no women down there. That was an issue that I'm willing to answer questions about if you want me to. But each man had to be planned as to where he was going to go to get on his helicopter or get in a landing craft to get out at the right time to hit the deadline of getting ashore. And, you know, the Royal Marines did just a fabulous job of that. I mean, it was really outstanding. And that expertise you have to maintain. You can't just decide you're going to save money and just get away with it and know, well, we've got more money, we'll buy it back again. It doesn't happen. You know, that's a really important skill to have. Amphibious operations is not the same as sea transport, which is basically what we do. I mean, if you think of all the operations we've had, and when I say we, I'm talking about as an American, it's all been sea transport. You know, you go ashore, you just transported, you go ashore at a dock, and then you enter into contracts with people to supply you with stuff wherever you are. It's a completely different game. And that's why I go to 29 Palms every 3 months and talk to the logistics course with Major General Ken Pravitsky, who's written a brilliant book called Logistics in the Falklands, except he didn't realize that Royal Engineers run their own logistics, but that's another issue. And we have a wonderful time with those young Marines down there. And it just fills my heart with joy to go there, because these are such wonderful people. If the future of our country is in those young Marines that I meet every 3 months, then we have nothing to worry about. You know, the Gurkhas were certainly around, but they weren't actually involved in any direct combat at all. Now, there's actually an excellent book called The Gurkhas in the Falklands War, written by a guy called Mike Sear, who's a Sandhurst buddy of mine. And Sear's devoted his whole life to writing about the Gurkhas, and also the Battle of Mount Tumbledown here. So, you know, the role the Gurkhas played, yeah, they were indeed there. They obviously arrived at the end, and I'm sure they would have been highly effective if they'd actually been engaged. Their job was to go on and take Sapper Hill, but they didn't have to do that because the Argentine had already surrendered by then. The person who took the fall was Lord Carrington, who was the Foreign Secretary. Now the intelligence organizations in the UK are organized differently to here, because the Secret Intelligence Service, better known as MI6, reports into the Foreign Secretary. So that's like having the CIA reporting into the State Department. And that makes sense, actually, because most of their operations are out of embassies around the place. So because the intelligence failure was so huge and the intelligence organization fell under the Foreign Office, Lord Carrington, the Foreign Secretary, resigned. And he was a very close friend of Margaret Thatcher. But he felt he had to do the honourable thing and resign. I mean, personally, I'd like to have seen John Knott resign, or as I said, shot. But he didn't. He was Sir John Knott. The British Navy is maintaining its carrier expertise by serving on US carriers. But why we would get rid of the Harrier Force, well, I mean, it's not my call, but it seems weird. Well, if you think back to the time when the Royal Navy was maintaining the peace at sea, the same as the US Navy does now, and in those days, ships were running on coal, right? So it's a bit difficult to resupply ships at sea with coal. And just imagine it, just passing the coal across, you know. Oh, it just doesn't work, right? I mean, you've got to have coaling stations and locations where ships could go in and then fill up with coal. And the Falkland Islands was absolutely crucial to the Brits. And then people moved there. Actually, many of them from New Zealand, and then they, you know, they had a lot of sheep there, and they were farming there, and it became a British protectorate. You know, the few roads they had, they drove on the other side of the road. Interesting enough, when the Argentine landed, you know, just think of this symbolically. You want to land and make everyone feel that they're not really being occupied. So what do? You tell them all to drive on the other side of the road, and you tear all the English signs down and put them up in Spanish. I mean, that was a really inept move. But that's why. And then once it was occupied with British citizens who didn't want to be ruled by Argentina, because the Brits were here before Argentina was a country. They took it away from the Spanish. And the Argentinians believe that it's theirs because it's close to Argentina. Well, you know, that's like saying Alaska should be part of Canada. Well, perhaps it should, who knows. But the one thing the British were always good at was fighting at night. I mean, all the training we did was at night. I mean, for example, as an Arbin engineer, you know, I had to learn to drive a tank and steer it around, but it was all at night, you know, navigating at night. In Norway, all our skiing and movement was at night, climbing at night. Because we felt we were going to eventually take on the Russians. And we didn't have any night vision aids at all. The Argentine actually did have some, which we found quite useful when we captured them. But I think it was our familiarity and happiness with the dark and the willingness to fight in the dark, and also the ability to bring down naval gunfire and artillery support very accurately. Because you do win battles with soldiers being tough and fighting, but you really win battles with firepower. And that's what the US Marine Corps does really, really well. Now, we were short of firepower because our history was counterinsurgency operations in Northern Ireland, where we were just with a rifle. You know, we didn't have, any of us, any experience of this sort of warfare other than just what we had learned. We didn't have any practical experience. But at the end of the day, all of the stuff that you learn at school and going through various courses about fully coordinating and focusing firepower is what actually wins battles. You try and create a group that's an enemy and blame them. You try and create some sort of external threat to try and get people together. I mean, it's a great tool. I mean, Christine Kirchner, who's, thank goodness, no longer there, you know, was using it all the time. The Malvinas, we've got to get the Malvinas back, and well, we need to be all together, and we hate the Brits, and all that sort of stuff. So, sure, I mean, unscrupulous politicians will manipulate anything to their advantage. I talked to a group of my soldiers just before they were going to go in for the assault landing, because I went in by helicopter at first light to pick where the airfield was going to be. And I pointed out to them that the green beret they were wearing, you know, Army commandos were commandos before the Royal Marines were. You know, that beret goes back to a whole series of extraordinary heroism throughout the Second World War and since. And it was their turn now. They volunteered for this. Not only did they volunteer for the military, they volunteered to be commandos. Well, now you're going to earn it. And it's up to you to live up to the tradition of that beret. You'll notice that the Royal Marines and the Army Commandos virtually never wore a steel helmet. I didn't wear one once throughout the campaign, other than when I was being buried, when I did manage to grab it out and pull it over my head when those bombs went off. Because that was our image, our ethos. Now, you might say it's really stupid not wearing a steel helmet in combat, but it wasn't to us. If I turned up not wearing a green beret, my soldiers would have thought I was a coward. And they all felt the same way. So I think, and it's the same with, you know, within the US Marine Corps, the tradition and the spirit within the US Marine Corps goes back many, many years. And if you think about the operations in the Pacific, every single young Marine who goes into action in Iraq or in Afghanistan carries that with him or her. And it drives your behavior. It's incredibly important. We learned a huge amount about how to build ships from the way these ships behaved when they were hit. And a lot of it was around the electrical wiring. And the type of wiring you have there when it's mixed with seawater, when it's burning, and it turns into hydrochloric acid, and then starts burning your electronics out. So there was a lot learned there, but this idea that aluminum ships are crap or, you know, don't work or burn, it's just not true. What the Navy learned, because they didn't have the firepower to shoot these missiles down, because, you know, automatic Gatling guns and these, the systems that we have on the US ships would just take them out of the water. But they would turn head on into the missile and then fire chaff. And that would work. And most of the ships that were hit, they were either close to the shore when an excerpt was fired from the shore and they didn't see it till the last minute, or they just didn't spot it. But if they were able to spot it, then they were able to avoid it. The big problem for the Brits was we had no early warning aircraft, none at all. What we had was submarines who went close to the Argentinian coast, near where the aircraft were taking off, and they would watch them take off and then warn us that they were coming. But if they missed them, there was no way the Navy could find them because we didn't have any early warning aircraft. You just think of what a fleet carrier has. I mean, it's awesome. They've got early warning radar way out there, they can see everything coming, but we didn't have any of that. So we were really vulnerable. And oh, by the way, the French were really, really helpful to the British. I mean, they shut down all supplies of Exocet missiles and any technical support to the Argentine. But the Argentine managed to set those missiles up themselves on their Super Étendard French aircraft and did a really good job of doing that. But the French have to be given credit for shutting that down. Well, there are two types of Harriers, basically. There's a Harrier GR3, which is a ground attack Harrier, which the Royal Air Force had. And then there's the Sea Harrier, which is a fighter. And they're designed, they look different. You know, the Sea Harrier's got a really nice pointy nose, and the GR3 is sort of ugly looking thing on the front. The Sea Harrier is much sexier. But the Royal Air Force deployed GR3 ground attack Harriers onto the carriers. So that we had both types, which is why once we'd built that airfield, we had 2 GR3 and 2 Sea Harriers deployed there at first light. So we had the air-to-air capability with the Sea Harriers and the ground attack capability with the GR3. Mark you, they could equally do, they could both fight in the air and they could both do ground attack. So even though a brigade attack was actually taking on separate hills, and then there were clear boundaries in between to make sure they didn't shoot each other. So that worked fine. And what they took some time to really get on top of was to be able to coordinate and synchronize the ground artillery, which they were used to because that's what they did on exercise, but also with naval gunfire support. And the guys, the Army commandos from the artillery regiment were specialized at bringing in naval gunfire support. And they would deploy with the units. And then we would be able to, coordinate all of that. But it took some time. I mean, as I say, 2 Paras attack, the final attack on Wireless Ridge, which I joined just at first light, was superb, because they had everything. They had gunfire support, they had Harriers in support, they had light tanks in support, and they had moved beyond, the sort of NATO training of running around with a rifle and, machine gun groups and all this sort of thing, which is okay, but it's not what really does the business. They only had a limited amount of time over the Falklands. Now, the Super Étendards were doing air-to-air refueling, so they had a much longer range when they were going after our ships. But the guys coming in from Argentina and flying straight into here, they only had a limited amount of time over target. They would come in and attack us and then turn around and go back. And the Harriers would shoot them as they were running away with the Sidewinder missiles. Now, the new Sidewinders that the Israelis gave up and the Americans shipped to us in Ascension, they were designed for head-on. But actually, there wasn't a single engagement that was head-on. So it was great to have the new Sidewinders, but their capability was never used. Every single Argentine aircraft that was shot down from the back. And the Harrier pilots, I have to, they were really awesome. I mean, the best pilots were selected for Harriers because they're so difficult to fly. The chances of surviving a tour with the Harrier squadron you know, there's a number against it. Because, you know, if you're trying to land it vertically, it can flip over and you get killed. So only the very, very best pilots from the Air Force and the Navy went to flying Harriers. And it's probably the same in the US Marine Corps as well. And they were really awesome. So from UN Southern Battalion, we had a number of areas where we could land. And then we put SBS and SAS ashore, you know, from submarines or helicopters. And they cruised around and said, well, there's not many people here. I think this might be a good place. So that's essentially how we did it. The closer we got to Stanley, the more likely we were to have to meet a substantial opposition when we landed. You know, an amphibious force is at its weakest when it lands. I mean, if you're defending against an amphibious attack, you want to hit them on the beach. Don't let them get ashore. Don't let them get into logistics ashore. Hit them on the beach. So we had to go ashore where there was limited opposition. We had opposition, but it was very light. And the Argentine were almost incapable of moving their forces around. You know, they had a sort of Maginot Line mentality. You know, they were in set defensive positions, but apart from a few counterattacks, they didn't maneuver entire units around. I mean, they should have done. If that had any sense, they would have. They had 1,200 people in Goose Green down the road. They should have attacked us. But they didn't. They just didn't think we could make it. They didn't believe we were coming across the mountains. So as much as I, you know, deride the fact that we were told to attack Goose Green and that 5 Brigade was there, actually that reinforced what the Argentines believed we would do. They thought we would come down the easy route to Stanley. And so when they saw us attack Goose Green, when they saw 5 Brigade move to Fitzroy, that just confirmed. They thought that was just a feint. They didn't think anyone would be insane enough to come across those high mountains in an Antarctic winter. I mean, Brits are naturally devious and they're kind of good at all this manipulation. And they were up against Gene Kirkpatrick, who was the US representative in the UN, who was very pro-Argentine. It was Caspar Weinberger, who was really the guy who supported us. And he was actually knighted at the end. I mean, the Brits gave him the highest possible award they could give anyone. And if he had been a British citizen, he would have been Sir Caspar Weinberger, sort of KCB. And he was terrific. And Caspar Weinberger and Gene Kirkpatrick were really at each other's throats. And Reagan was sort of in the middle of it. And he was friendly with Margaret Thatcher, as you know. That was important, that relationship. But yeah, Caspar Weinberger's our hero. What we really wanted to do was to sink the carrier, the Cinco de Mayo, on the Cinco de Mayo, on the 5th of May. I mean, we were really trying to do that. That would have been awesome. But we didn't. And the Navy, the Navy scuttled back into port, you're quite right. And in fact, at the end of the war, the Argentine had an investigation, and Anaya, you know, Admiral Anaya, they were going to actually execute him because the Navy showed such cowardice. If you've got a Navy, you've got to understand that these ships fight, and you've got to accept you're going to lose ships. And the idea that, and we tend to be a bit like that at times as well, that, oh my gosh, you know, we've had a ship that's been, you know, blown up by a terrorist or whatever. Well, you know, that's what the ships are there for. I mean, they're there to fight. And if a Navy's going to fight, you're going to lose ships, and you've got to accept that. You don't scuttle back into port because you might lose a ship. You know, it's like trying to do an infantry attack and not have anyone killed. Well, It actually doesn't work like that. As long as the Argentine were in Stanley, they had control of the Falklands, they had a negotiating position. But once they lost Stanley, what did they have? They could have hundreds of troops in Fox Bay or 1,000 people in Goose Green. They couldn't do anything. Stanley was the vital ground. One of the finest attacks was done by 4-2 Commando, who got their commando engineers to breach through the minefield and breach right round to the back of the Argentine position. And the entire commando, this is, classically sort of Royal Marines thinking about it, sneaked their way right the way around and then attacked the Argentines from the rear and totally surprised them, and they surrendered. Completely surprised them. It was a silent attack, and it was superb. Now, you might say, well, why didn't I say that was the best attack? Well, because I was looking at how you coordinate all these other assets, and they were coordinated best in the 2-para attack on Wireless Ridge. But it was a magnificent achievement, that. The bloodiest battle was Mount Longdon with 3-para, and that was just hand-to-hand fighting from rock to rock. But don't forget, they're fighting at night and in small fire teams and just working their way forward, killing people as they went. And it tends to be a little chaotic night fighting, and you've got to be careful you don't shoot your own people. But if you're used to it and you do a lot of it, on exercise, and you feel comfortable at night, then you've got a tremendous advantage over any enemy that's not used to that sort of activity.